Hi, it's Mark from Top Local. We're here with Bernie Pawlik, Pawlik Automotive in Vancouver, serving Vancouver for almost 30 years. #1 rated auto repair facility in Vancouver. How you doing, Bernie?
Doing well.
So we're going to talk about an old favorite, a Ford 6-liter diesel. This was in a 2005 Ford F450. What was going on with this vehicle?
Well, this vehicle was would intermittently die while the client was driving the vehicle. All of a sudden, it would just stop running, and he eventually had it towed into our shop. Interestingly enough, prior to this happening, about 2 weeks ago, he had the vehicle towed in because it wouldn't start. We had a look at it, diagnosed it, and found there was no oil sitting in the oil filter housing, which will certainly cause the engine not to start because the vehicle requires oil pressure, high pressure oil to fire the fuel injectors. And what we found with that issue, and this could be a separate post, but I'll be very brief here, the oil filter had been replaced with an aftermarket oil filter, which can, from time to time, cause, for some reason, it causes the oil to drain out of the oil filter housing and no oil pressure. So we replaced it with a Ford oil filter and the proper oil filter cap, and no problem. So we were surprised actually to hear a couple weeks later that the vehicle was doing what seemed to be a similar kind of thing. We did a diagnosis on it, scanned it, and we found a trouble code stored for an IPR valve circuit issue. So we performed some diagnostic tests around that and found some issues with the IPR valve.
Okay, what's an IPR valve?
So the IPR valve stands for injection pressure regulator, and what that valve does is it sits on top of the high pressure oil pump housing, and it adjusts the oil pressure based on computer inputs to just get the oil pressure just right to fire the fuel injectors at a proper rate. This valve can open and close the flow of the oil.
Okay, complicated. So
yeah.
what kind of diagnosis did you have to do to find what was going on?
Well, what we had to do, so once we started diagnosing it, the engine was cool. It fired up right away, which can be kind of annoying, but I guess it's good. So we ran it, warmed it up. We can do tests on our scan tool to operate the IPR valve. Everything seemed to be fine. Warmed it up, seemed to be fine. So our technician took it out for a road test, and out on the road it died, which is kind of embarrassing right in the middle of Marine Drive. Sitting there wouldn't start. But nonetheless, we got some good information. The IPR valve was commanding 85%, which is allowing full oil flow, and yet it was only developing 200 psi of pressure. So there's clearly a problem with the valve or the circuit. And fortunately, once we called the tow truck, before the tow truck arrived, the engine cooled down enough. For some reason, it seemed like when it was cooler, it would work, but it was an electrical problem, with the valve itself.
What kind of pressure would it normally have been operating at?
Well, you need at least around 500 psi for the engine to even fire. So, at idle you need that. But I believe, I should know the stuff exactly, but I think we're up to around 2,500 psi of oil pressure. So there's a lot of pressure in this system. So it'll vary depending on the engine speed. I mean, when you're revving it up, that's when the pressure's highest. But it needs at least 500 to get it running. So if it doesn't develop that, it just cranks over.
So did you find anything else? I guess you had to replace the valve?
Yeah, we replaced the valve, and this valve is located rather buried under the turbocharger area of the engine. So there's a lot of heat in this area, and there's also an electrical connector, obviously, because it's an electrical valve, that can be problematic as well. So we replaced the pigtail end, which is a wire, and I'll show you some photos in a minute, about 6 inches long plus the connector. And when we took that apart, we also found the wiring was starting to flake apart. So this could have, again, been part of the problem. So it's always good when you do a repair to make sure you do things thoroughly, and if it's not a whole lot of extra work to change the wiring harness, the little wiring end while you're at it. So we did that. I'll just share a couple of photos here while we're at it. And where are we here? Photos. Okay, this is the IPR valve. There's the unit right there. This screws into the housing on the high pressure oil pump. The oil basically is forced in this area. It comes out here, and depending on which way the valve commands it to flow, it'll flow at different spots on the valve. There's the electrical connector area, and this is the actual wiring pigtail we replaced. Now you'll notice here that this wire is bare. It wasn't completely bare when we exposed it, but in the process of taking it off, the insulation started flaking apart. So, you know, it was actually cracked when we went to do it, when we actually started taking it apart. So that, you know, is a sure sign that there's a problem there. And if it wasn't causing a problem now, it certainly would have down the road. So always best to do repairs thoroughly.
So IPR valves, are they a common failure on 6 liters?
They are. We actually replace these quite frequently. It's one of those items that, you know, there's a whole list of parts on one of these vehicles. If someone said, hey, should I buy one? What can go wrong with it? The IPR valve is one of those items I'd list as a pretty common failure part. I mean, we don't do tons of them, but enough that it's a common failure item.
So is there anything else that you'd look for when you're replacing this part?
Well, it's funny you should ask, because yes, there is. And I'll share one more photo here. There's a screen at the end of the IPR valve. This is looking down the top of the valve, and you'll see this is a screen here. This is where the oil gets forced in from the oil pump. Looking for debris on the screen is a critical issue, because these can plug up. There's a lot of things that can go wrong with the oil system on these vehicles. Things can wear out. There's filter screens further down the flow, closer to the oil pump, where the screens can break apart and they can plug the oil pumps up and do all sorts of things. So we checked the screen pretty thoroughly. Unfortunately, there's nothing really much. There's a tiny little metal bit. I mean, that's a tiny little particle, but other than that, there's really nothing else wrong with it. But that's certainly something that we look at when we do this. I mean, if this screen was plugged, that would indicate we'd have to take the high pressure oil pump off and the oil filter housing and really inspect things and look at it. So a lot of things can fail on these engines that can cause some problems. 2,500
PSI means a lot of potential issues, I think, over time. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. I mean, that's one thing that makes these engines a bit problematic, is the oil pressure system. It's an extra level of complexity, and where the 6.4 liter, it just uses a high pressure fuel pump, and they eliminated that high pressure oil system. It just adds an extra level of complexity. I mean, it's a neat idea, and they used it for a long time in the 7.3 liter and then into the 6 liter. But you know, it does add complexity that's eliminated when you just have high pressure fuel.
So there you go. These guys are experts in 6 liter diesels, as we talked about many times before. If you need any kind of service on your Ford diesel, these are the guys to see in Vancouver. Pawlik Automotive, you can reach them at 604-327-7112, or check out their website, pawlikautomotive.com. Many videos on diesels in there. Thanks a lot, Bernie.
Thanks, Mark.